Hello and welcome to Leaving Nothing Undared, a podcast from Oblate School of Theology's Department of Continuing Education. I'm your host, Antonio Frietze, and I'm privileged to be in conversation today with someone whose work has shaped countless spiritual lives through his teaching and writing and pastoral insight, Father Ron Rolheiser. Father Ron will be joining us as a keynote speaker for the 2026 Summer Institute, exploring this year's theme, Mysticism, Soul, and Psyche. Father Ron's work consistently invites us into deeper awareness of God's presence in the ordinary rhythms of life and a more honest engagement with the movements of the soul. Let's dive in. Father Ron, welcome to Leaving Nothing Undared. It's such a joy to have us together again. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Antonio.
It's our pleasure. So, as our audience knows, you're one of our keynote speakers for the 2026 Summer Institute, the theme of which is Mysticism, Soul, and Psyche. And I wanted to start by asking you, when you hear that theme, what most resonates with you?
Just putting those three words together. That's wonderful. Mysticism, soul, and psyche. I'm concerned today. I think we're becoming, if I can phrase it that way, we're becoming mystically tone deaf. We're not listening to our souls. We're not hearing our psyche. And I like putting those three words together, that they belong together. Mysticism, soul, psyche. There's a trinity there that needs to be together.
Definitely. And, a lot of your work does a great job of helping people enter into an understanding of some of these themes, right? Particularly mysticism and soul. Nonetheless, that work is so valuable because when people hear mysticism, it can be kind of jarring or off-putting, or it can be, too big for us to approach sometimes. Could you share how you might express the meaning of mysticism in a way that connects with people's everyday lives?
Yeah. I'll start with an incident. I teach courses on mysticism, John of the Cross, and so sometimes the first night of class, I'll ask them, why are you taking this course? And one night a woman said, because I'm a practicing mystic. Well, that raised eyebrows, So can you be a practicing mystic? I think mysticism is one of the really, unfortunately, misunderstood words. I think when people think of mysticism, they think of extraordinary religious experience, visions and so on. That's not what it's about. In extraordinary circumstances, you can have that, but most mystics, there are no extraordinary experiences. It's deep, ordinary experience. The definition I use comes from Ruth Burroughs, British mystic, and Ruth Burroughs says, mysticism is being touched in a deep way that you can't think it, you can't necessarily feel it, you just know it, And she shares her own experience. Her major mystical experience said she was a high school senior. She said, and I was a airheaded young woman. She said, and I went on a retreat and we were acting out, and the sisters pulled us aside. Those who were acting out, we had to sit in chapel for certain hours on end. She said, and I'm sitting there. She said, and all of a sudden, she said, I had a moment of absolute clarity where I knew who I was. I knew where I came from. Said just intuition. Said so. It's a moment of deep where you get touched in your soul, and so it's not having visions and so on.
Well, that's a relief to me, I'm sure, and to a lot of our audience. But to enter more deeply into the kind of practical dimension of it, we exist in a moment where, there are multiple factors competing for our attention. We're often drawn outside of ourselves into the hustle and bustle of the demands of work and everyday life. How could we live in a way where we're more attentive to those moments or to the movements of our soul? How can we practice that kind of attentiveness as hopeful mystics?
Well, we have the common thing in culture, try to watch the sunset and so on. And that's important. Remember Jim Findlay, when he spoke here, he said, why don't you go out some night and just watch it get dark? no other thing, but more deeply, as a practicing mystic, um, we should practice where we try to be in front of God, in front of ourselves, with no filters. You know, can I use a colorful word here?
Please.
I was once visited a friend of mine who was dying of cancer, and he said, when you're dying of cancer, he said it cuts away all the bullshit, and see, so that we have ego, we have trauma, we have ideologies, and so it's hard to get to, the word sincere comes from two Latin words, sine cera, which means without wax. Who are you without wax, without ego? See, and when we touch those places, we're touching our mystical center. And, and that's why, for instance, practices like centering prayer or just, where you every day just spend some time trying to say, who am I? Who am I really? And that's not that easy to do. You have ego, you have trauma, you have your ideologies, you have all this stuff. It's hard to get, as the guy said, beyond all the bullshit. Just who am I really? And when you touch that, you'll be touching your mystical center.
Hmm. And as you note, it's a challenge, right? And
Yeah.
this year, it's mysticism, soul, and psyche.
Yeah.
So as much as we're engaging mysticism and getting into greater contact with our soul and that level of experience, we're also pulling in some folks from the world of psychology and mental health, recognizing that these two things, our spiritual growth and our mental health, have something to do with one another. Could you share a bit about how you view that relationship between our mental well-being and our spiritual growth?
Yeah. You said they have something with the other. They have a lot to do with each other. Like your psyche is the part of your soul that you're conscious of and so on. It is your soul, So it's very important. And, as humans, we're not spiritual and then you are one, So for me or for you or somebody to come to, to be what we call becoming a soulful person, it also means that, that you basically have to be deeply integrated in your psyche. Your psyche has to be at peace. That's part of your soul. We have separate words for them, but one is a psychological word, one's a spiritual word. In some sense, they're the same thing, um, so, and I think spirituality sometimes has failed us by divorcing that, like this is spiritual direction, this is counseling, this is this. I mean, we need to keep them theoretically separate, but they're one and the same thing. You're doing, with psyche, you're doing soul work. With soul, you're doing psyche work. you know, um, uh, they're together. You're a human being. You're not, partly you're spiritual and partly you're psyche. You're both.
Hmm. This kind of holistic approach to the human person and human being is, I would say, one of the themes that emerges in the work that you've been producing over some time. For a little bit, we might say you've been talking about spiritual growth and the necessity for people to take seriously this spiritual dimension of their experience. For someone who's been working and speaking and writing in this space for some time, could you share a bit about why today, maybe more than ever, but definitely today, it's so important for us to engage in this conversation around the intersection of mental wellness and spiritual growth, and to have this approach toward a holistic human experience?
Yeah, let me start this way. We have two tendencies. Spiritual people. The congenital fault is oftentimes we write off the body, we write off the psyche, we write off sexuality, and then we're less than whole. And then oftentimes people who are more immersed in that write off the spiritual. Basically, we have to be spiritual and holistic, which means we have to take the soul seriously. We have to take the body seriously. We have to take sex seriously. We have to take, the earthy part seriously, but also the heavenly part seriously. Heavenly people tend to write off the earth, and the earthly people tend to write off heaven. It's um, holism, I'm glad you break this up. It's so important, because we're not going to find peace, inside of ourselves unless it's somehow holistic. We have the spiritual, the psychological, the bodily, the sexual, everything somehow integrated. And it's a task. I said, like, we fall off two sides. Spiritual people don't take the body seriously, and psyche seriously, and psyche body oftentimes don't take spirituality seriously.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and it stands in stark contrast. I know that you've utilized this kind of metaphor or illustration before of integration versus disintegration, right? And we kind of exist in a time, I think it's not controversial to say, of disintegration, right? We're being pushed toward these kind of different split versions of ourselves and our identities. And in my view, the Summer Institute is this great opportunity to advance the cause of integration as individuals. That's one of the reasons that, of course, we're asking you to serve as a keynote speaker. But I think it would be helpful for our audience if you, without giving the whole thing away, shared a bit of what you hope people take away from their experience at the Summer Institute and from your keynote presentation.
Okay, several things. What do I take away? I hope, first of all, to demystify mysticism, because it's this, for too many people, it's just this exotic thing, to bring it down to where you can become a practicing mystic, and you need to become a practicing mystic, But in my particular presentation, I want to relate it to a concept I call moral loneliness, so that it's a concept I got from Robert Coles, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard, and he wrote a book on Simone Weil, and he says, like, she suffered from moral loneliness. And it's interesting, when you tease that out, we're lonely in many different ways. Like, we're lonely, psychologically, emotionally, we're lonely sexually, and so on, But Cole said, more deeply than you long for even a sexual partner, you long for a moral partner. Somebody who can sleep with you at the deepest level, what Merton used to call the point de It's just your ultimate virginity. Who are you really underneath there, And what I want to do in my talk is to show how mysticism touches that center, a couple of examples. For instance, some of the classical mystics, they say that, before you were born, this is kind of mythological and beautiful, it said, your soul is kissed by God. And all through your life, you remember unconsciously that kiss. Then you evaluate everything. You've once been loved perfectly. So now in human life, well, nothing quite measures up, Or Bernard Lonergan says that he said, we're born, he said, we're branded with the first principles. And the first principle are oneness, goodness, truth, and beauty. He said, they're stamped into you. And so you don't have to learn them, you recognize them. And when you see something beautiful, it triggers your soul. You see something good, it triggers your soul, That's what we say, it touches your soul, Or even simplistically, we say something, this rings true. Just take that expression, this rings true. What does it mean? Rings true to what? Is there some bell inside of you? No, there is. See, it rings true to that unconscious, memory of the deep kiss, or the oneness, goodness, truth, and beauty. They're stamped into you. When you see them, they just touch you. They just touch you. It's interesting, the mystics, that a kind of a cute little thing. They say, they said the last thing God does when he puts the soul in the body, he seals your memory from the past that, and he says, and he does it by under your lips here, close, and he said, and that's why when you're trying to think of something, unconsciously your finger was under your nose and so on. But what I want to try to touch, Antonio, is the moral loneliness. And I want to give some graphic examples. So I'll give you an example. I was teaching at the University of Saskatchewan. One year I had a young woman, 30 years old in my class, very, very bright, and I had him read Christopher de Vink's book on precious memories, She came in after the semester and said, Father, says, that's the best book I've ever read, and it's changing my life. then she said this, says, she says, I grew up with no moral or religious background, said, and I've stuck my way through 2 Canadian provinces, said, but now I realize I want this. I want my sexuality has to take me home. Said up to now, whenever I have sex, I go home. Said there's something wrong. It has to be home. Notice that book touched her mystical center. Said, like, I'm not doing this right. I want to get home. See that's she's touching her moral center. And as we experience that, in our longing for a soulmate. The deepest longing is a soulmate, and a soulmate is deeper than a sexual partner or something. So, it can be the sexual partner, but a soulmate. We're longing for a soulmate, and that's coming out of our mystical center. So I'm going to risk trying this to see, because I don't want them just have a bland thing. These are the mystics, and it's got to be something that's somehow alive and tries to touch people.
I think that sense of longing for being touched at that mystical center, or being seen or encountering at that mystical center, is something that is like mysticism, deeply appealing, and at the same time can be a bit daunting or a bit scary. At Oblate School of Theology, we welcome all kinds of people, and they have very meaningful experiences of growth here. But if someone were to be seeing this conversation for the first time, and they've never had any encounter with you or your work or Oblate or mysticism, and they hear us talk about these themes and they feel a longing for it, but there's some sense of it being too much, or maybe being afraid of going to that place in their journey, what would you want them to hear?
Well, that's why I'm glad we're doing this. We have to overcome their fear, that kind of, that mysticism, it's an exotic thing, and it's for the few elitist, the Teresa of Avalon, John of the Cross, and Julian of Norwich, and so on. So we have to dispel their fear. That's why I used the expression, we need to demystify mysticism. It's not some exotic thing out there, it's for all of us, and it's a way for us precisely to come home, to come to peace, to recognize beauty, truth, goodness, and so on, and also to come to sincerity in our own lives. How do we get below ego, beyond wound, beyond ideology, beyond woke and MAGA and everything else in our culture? How do you get to something that this is Antonio, this is actually me, without wax, but we have to get to that. We have to overcome their fears, and and it's understandable. The word scared me for years. I didn't want to read John of the Cross. I didn't, it's kind of think these are exotic people. They're not. So I'm glad you picked this theme. That and also linking to soul. Because I worry about our culture. Obviously, you do too. That we don't take soul seriously enough. We're so caught up in the pragmatics. If I'm looking at a screen 23 hours a day, I'm not going to be very soulful. That's sorry if that sounds harsh, but
yeah, it's desperately needed in our time, again, because there are so many factors of life seemingly conspiring to cut us off from ourselves at that most intimate level. Father Ron, I take this opportunity to share with you that over the time that I've gotten to know you, I am ever more and every day more appreciative of God's vocation to you to be an attendant to people finding that center in themselves, that mystical center, and finding who they really are. It is invaluable work. Yeah. And I thank you for doing it. And I thank you for this conversation today.
Well, I appreciate it, and when I say we're becoming soulless, I want to say that with a lot of sympathy, because I'm no exception, I want to give you an interesting comment I heard. I was listening to NPR radio one day, and they were interviewing a journalist and his wife, an American journalist, but they had lived in Paris for 8 years, And while they were in Paris, because they were journalists, alternate, they didn't have a TV, they weren't into culture and who Taylor Swift is and so on. And their son was born. And so he grew up with artistic parents and so on. And then they moved back to New York, So he's like 8 years old now and so on. So they asked the parent, has he held out against, pop culture? The guy laughed and said, for about 2 days, he said, nobody holds out against popular culture. He said, this is the expression, said, our culture today is the most powerful narcotic ever perpetrated. It eats us whole. It is so hard to somehow, I like to say, it's a powerful narcotic. I say this, we're not just addicted to drugs, we are addicted to, and I mean, I feel for people and I struggle myself. I've always made a resolution. I'm not going to be addicted to my cell phone. I'm not going to be addicted to email and stuff, but I'm checking it every hour. so, so I can tell in my mind I'm not addicted, but you have to check. It's just kind of the way we live today. But we can lose soul in all of that.
And that's, again, why I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to do this work and to work with you to bring something like the Summer Institute to people, because it's, I think, a wonderful antidote to pretty much every other area of our lives. It's an opportunity to come back together with people who are equally concerned with finding that mystical center and developing that sense of communion with one another and with God. So thank you, Father.
I'll give you a compliment too. Choosing this topic, imagine if your topic had been, let's look at AI in the future. Instantly, I don't know if you saw the news yesterday, but on Saturday, 3 different commencement speakers who were, promoting AI were booed by the students. They booed them, right? So nothing against AI, but it hasn't got a soul. Like somebody said, you want to know a little irony? Today, you have to, for a computer, you have to check off that you're not a robot. A little irony there. You got to prove to a robot that you're not a robot,
Well, conversations like these definitely affirm for me my humanity and yours. So if there's one thing I'm certain of, you're not a robot, Father Ron.
Feel like one sometimes,
Well, we look forward to seeing you at the Summer Institute.
Well, I look forward to it. It's a great, great topic. Like those 3 words belong together, and soul, holism, it's mysticism. And we're going to try to demystify mysticism.
I'm sure we will.
Okay. Thanks, Antonio.
Thank you, Father.
Okay.